I am so very thankful to be here with you today. There's a couple of things I want to address as kind of housekeeping items. I've been a high school classroom teacher for 14 years. And one of the things that I find is way more effective for us to learn from is when we learn from each other. Do you know that to be true? Okay, so what I'm going to ask is before we get going, those that are kind of sitting off to the edges, way out there to the edges all by yourself, you won't get to participate if you're way out there. And you might be going, I don't care, I don't want to participate. I don't even really know that I want to be here today. But right now, for the next 20 seconds would be your opportunity to find your way forward. I'm told that these private chairs that are out here are for anybody's taking once I start speaking. And if that wasn't told to me, I just made it up. So here's the deal. I really would like to encourage you that are really out there. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to share with a partner or a neighbor or a friend. Nothing that's going to be hard for you to share. Nothing that's going to be, too close to your heart. But just going to share some responses to what we're learning today. Thank you. Let's give them a hand. Two brave people who said, okay, we're moving up. Seriously, the rest of you are welcome to move in and move forward and get close to somebody, because in about 10 minutes, you're going to get to have an opportunity to share. And I would love for you to be near somebody to make that happen easily. So thank you for those of you that are moving. You today, this afternoon, that have come to sit under this dome are among the most courageous at Arizona camp meeting. Why do I say that? Because just knowing that we're going to talk about something that's sensitive, that might have a place in your heart that is still hurting, and you still show up here today, that takes courage. I tell my coaching clients that when you give me that first phone call and say, I need some help with my grief, can we meet? That takes courage. So to enter into a space where there might possibly be some conversation about something that's painful takes courage. And I commend each one of you for being courageous enough to be here today. Our book, Comfort for the Day, is a scripture-guided grief recovery journal. It's going to be made available to you when we are done with this first session today. Right over there, Sandy will be over there with the books, and you may pick one up at a camp meeting special price for only $15. No tax or shipping is added to that. But let me tell you that tomorrow we're going to be referring to this book and using this book in the workshop. So we're going to talk a little bit about it later on, but Comfort for the Day does not include our story. So you getting to be here today will get to hear our story. So this is what is not in the book. And I'm going to invite my husband to come forward. And I'm going to see if the screen, I want it to go to the next slide. Well, yeah, there we go. They found me again. As we share with you our story. So Steve's going to start out.
Well, we've been traveling this journey for 34 years now. So it's not a new thing for us, but we're still 34 years later, still finding things out about the journey of grief. And maybe until the Lord comes, we'll always be finding out something new, won't we? But many years ago, back in the 1980s, I graduated from Walla Walla College, and we got hired on to teach school up in little big town of Anchorage, Alaska. And it was there that our firstborn son was conceived and born. We named him Dawson. We had gone through Dawson Creek. Dawson sounded like a fun Northwest name, so that's what we named him. And after being in Alaska for several years teaching, the Lord really convicted me that I needed to be doing something a little different than teaching. I didn't know why at the time. It didn't seem to make much sense, but several of my parents were actual literature evangelists, colporteurs, that sold books all over the state of Alaska, and they loved doing what they're doing, and they invited me to maybe consider doing it myself. And so I did, and I made the decision to do it full time and leave teaching. And a lot of people didn't think that was a very wise decision, and looking back, it was probably one of the best decisions that we've made. After I made the decision to become a literature evangelist, several of us, literature evangelist families, left Alaska, and we moved down to Montana. The literature work in Montana had all but about dried up, and we said we all felt an impression to go down and help get the work started in Montana again. This would have been in 1983. I drove down earlier. Karen was still up in Alaska with Dawson. She was 8 months pregnant with our second to come at that time, and was going to finish up the sale of our home there. When I got to Montana, we found it a much more challenging place to leave books than we did in Alaska, but it also created a higher development and a higher need to depend on the Lord. Finally, I called Karen up and I said, I really need you to come down and just be supportive down here. So we left the care of the sale of our home with some friends. Karen and Dawson came down, and within a few days, we noticed that he wasn't feeling very well. And he had bruising on his legs, and it was hard for him to walk. So we took him in to the local clinic, and they said, oh, he's got an ear infection. He's not feeling very well. But they also did a routine blood check on him at the same time. Several days later, we still didn't have a phone installed in our apartment at that time. I came home from work and working with families out in the community that day, and Karen said, there was a sheriff that was just here, and the clinic wants you to call them immediately, first thing in the morning. They don't like the looks of Dawson's blood. I said, boy, that doesn't sound good. So we went into the clinic the next day, and the doctor looked at us and he says, we've been looking at the blood samples that we took when you were here before, and we think that your son has leukemia. And we thought, oh, this doesn't sound good at all. And of course, you can only imagine what we were thinking at that moment. They said, we need to do a bone marrow sample just to make sure. So they took a bone marrow sample, and within about 30 minutes, the diagnosis came back as positive. And we said, well, what do we do? We've only been here for a month in Montana. They said, you need to leave because we don't have the facilities to deal with that type of cancer here. So we made the choice to go to Stanford's Children's Hospital in California because Karen's parents and my parents lived in California. It just made more sense. So we took him into the hospital there, and we entered into a whole new world of little bald heads, very sick children, very stressed out parents, and us included. And it was there that the doctors began to do the chemotherapy and do all they could to bring Dawson's leukemia into remission.
So landing into California with a very sick little boy, several things became very obvious very quickly. We knew we could never move back to Montana because his ongoing health treatment would have to carry on in California. So that meant that we were now homeless. Because of the nature of the transition of work from teaching to colporteuring, there was a 3-month probation without insurance. We were now without insurance. My pregnancy continued to progress as it would in every case, and I am now 8.5 months pregnant, and I'm living in the Ronald McDonald House as we continue to support and care for our son who's in the hospital. He has a double ear infection, pneumonia, and leukemia. And we have no home. A lot has gone on for us. Talk about being slammed. And we want to stand before you today as witnesses to the power of God who can take us through the darkest, most troublesome, most complicated times and seasons in our lives. God is good all the time. And the circumstances that we encounter here are what's to be really expected. Why would we be so surprised? Dawson responded well to the chemotherapy, and he was released from the hospital just about the same weekend that Joanna was due, but she came a week late. So that was a beautiful thing. We were able to transition towards the Sacramento area, move in with my parents then. And so now we at least had shelter over us, and our daughter that was born a week late, and our son that was now home and responding positively to the chemotherapy. Steve contacted the Northern California Conference office and said, I want a call porter in all of the foothill territory. And they said, well, first of all, we can't take you on because of your son. And we said, well, his leukemia needs have been covered now by the state. I just want to work. And then they said, well, you really can't work there because nobody can be successful selling in that kind of spread out community. But Steve was successful. And God provided for us so that 6 months later, we moved into our own little home in the foothills with our son in remission, a healthy 6-month-old baby little girl. I could stay home while Steve went to work. Our family was now covered by the insurance, and Dawson's coverage was still covered by the state. Wow, what a change in just 6 months. But then what?
Well, just about a year and a half into Dawson's remission, he would go in and get extra chemotherapy shots about every 3 months, and they would do routine blood tests every few months. The last time we had him in was in December of 1984, and we got some news back that they thought they may have seen some what they call leukoblasts in his blood. They weren't sure, but they wanted us to come back in and have him retested. We thought, well, this can't be. He's been in remission now for almost a year and a half. But we took him back to UC Davis Medical Center, who was now taking care of his medical needs, and they did another bone marrow sample, and they did more blood testing, and sadly, the results came back positive. And the oncologist there said, whatever you decide to do, if you choose to treat or not treat, we'll support you. And when you hear an oncologist say that, who are designed to treat these things sometimes at the bitter end, you know that they've done all they can do. So at that point we said, we've given the Babylonians their try at it. We're just going to totally leave our son in the care of the Lord and give him some respite from needles and chemo and things like that, and just make him as comfortable as possible. That was in January that we got the final diagnosis, and we had almost 3 months, actually 2 months, of just a very, very stress-free time with our son. I was thankful to be able to be working in literature evangelism at that time because I was self-employed. So if I needed to take a day off, I could do that. I just look at the guy in the mirror and say, you can have the day off. And that was such a blessing. But toward the end, he began to get more and more sick, and we began to realize that a miracle probably was not going to take place. And could we trust God with that not taking place? Sometimes our expectations and what we expect God to do are not the same plans that God has. We can't blame God for those. We know He's capable of healing. But God simply knows best. And His knowing best and not doing something doesn't always mean that that's what He wants. There's a big difference between God not doing something and possibly God can't do something because of the rules of the great controversy. So we watched our son slip away, and it was, well, let Karen pick it up from there.
It was Friday morning. That darkest just before dawn thing is really true. And we had called our pediatrician in the middle of the night and asked her to come be with us and to come help our son be comfortable. She got out of her comfortable bed and left her sweet boys with her husband and drove across town and came to be with us and stayed with us through that night. And just as the sun was just barely coming into light, Dawson breathes his last breath. That sacredness of life, that season when we fall asleep in Jesus, was also accompanied with the sweet peace that comes from Jesus. We didn't recognize that at the time, but our pediatrician did and made comment of that, which really helped later on to reestablish our faith when we asked that railing question, "Where are you, God, in the dark?" And where he was right where he always is, in the middle of the pain, right with us. So I want us to know that for sure. And that was when our grief journey began, falling into this chasm of completely the unknown, the unexpected, the unprepared for. We were 28 at the time and had never had a loss to have to deal with. So this is what has brought us to this point, to be here with you today. You each have your own lost stories, or you know people who have had their lost stories. And so what we want to recognize right from the very beginning that is so valuable and important is that your grief matters. Grief is not something that should be tucked in the back closet, swept under the rug, hushed over, don't talk about this. And yet, is that not what we grow up thinking to do with grief? I ask people frequently, and I will ask you, who has been your role model for healthy grief? That's right, Ken. Who's been your role model for healthy grief? Most of us say no one. A few, once in a while, I'll hear somebody say, I had an excellent role model for healthy grief. But most of us have no one. And so we think about grief like the culture around us impresses us with, oh, I got to be strong. I've got to be brave. I need to, not talk about it. I'll just put it away. And that's what we do with that brokenness in our hearts, isn't it? But I'm here to tell us right up from the get-go that your grief matters. And I'll tell you why it matters. It matters because it's connected to a relationship with someone. And that relationship mattered. Even if that relationship was broken and not very healthy, there are things about that need your healing and attention and God's healing and attention. So the grief matters, my friend. So let's find out. What matters? Anything that matters in our life has the risk of bringing great pain to us, doesn't it? If it matters, it has a risk of bringing great pain. And so in this illustration that I call the grief and loss umbrella, we're going to put a few things underneath this grief and loss umbrella that matter, that we feel about when something happens. The write-off from the top is when somebody that's important to us dies. Or if we go through a divorce and that relationship dies. And along with that death of that relationship, whether it's through the death of a loved one or through the choice of a loved one and the marriage ends, there's all these other little sub-losses. Like sometimes we can have a crisis of faith. We can lose our identity. We can lose relationships with other people because they were tied into that marriage. So many other sub-losses take place under the grief and loss umbrella. Next comes the death of a pet or the loss of our health. What about when we lose our abilities and life changes for us? We can't do the same things we used to do in the same way we used to do them. Those are losses to be grieved. Has anybody in this auditorium lost money? With the whole volatile thing of the economy that we live in, money can be lost very quickly. Or maybe it could be stolen. Or maybe an investment you had in your home never came through and money was lost. The loss of relationships can happen for a number of reasons. Sometimes we move away. Sometimes we change and the relationship grows apart instead of staying close. I've heard many parents say, I long for and I've lost the relationship of my little toddler when I sent them off to school. That toddler relationship no longer exists. A new one is coming into place, but they lose that relationship. What about the loss of a job? The loss of trust? The loss of dreams? Or the loss of security or innocence? You see, not all losses and griefs are tangible, are they? They can come for a lot of different causes. And I don't know if you have had a season in your life where you have had a loss of hope or a loss of faith, but many do. And so for the next minute, I'm going to ask you to just share with your neighbor, the closest neighbor next to you. We're not going to get into a very big group right now. We're going to do a group work in a little bit. But I'm going to get my timer here, and I'm going to put it on for 1 minute. And I'm going to ask you to share with the person you're sitting next to or behind you additional losses that could go under this grief umbrella. Okay? And while you're doing that, I'm going to just step down here. I'm going to talk to the folks that are watching on TV and talk a little bit about some more of the additional losses. But I'd like for you to do so. And when you're all done, we're going to get a microphone out and find out what are some of the other ones that can go underneath this loss umbrella. Are there any questions about the instructions? So you get to chat with each other for a little minute. I'm going to go talk to the people on TV. When this timer rings, you might not hear it, but I'll hear it, and we will kind of bring our conversations to a close. But see how many other losses you can put underneath that grief umbrella, and you may begin. Hopefully, you've been thinking of some other ideas of losses that you could add to the grief and loss umbrella yourself. So when we think about loss and grief, it's a much bigger experience than just the death of someone we love. We're just practicing, because this is the short one. In a few minutes, we're going to have a little longer time, and I'm going to come back to you directly on the camera. So just think about what are those other losses that you have had in your life, and add them to this list. And know that when you do so, that you validate that loss or that grief, because your grief matters, no matter what is it about. So, join me back up on the platform. Okay, folks. I love your hands being raised already. That is great. Do we have folks with a microphone? We've got a hand down here. We want to add to our grief and loss umbrella. He's coming right up. Oh, 4 is great. You bet. You bet. Okay, we just want to talk it into the microphone so the people on TV get to watch in here.
Oh, how fun. First one I came up with was home, and then physical loss, like a leg or an arm or a voice or eyes or anything like that.
Very good.
And then not being heard or understood. Actually, it's 3.
Thank you.
The loss of understanding, that no one hears or understands us. That is very good. I'm going to touch on the loss of the home, and I'm so grateful that you brought that up. We live not far from Paradise, California. You know what I mean. There's not only the loss of that home, but there's the loss of life. There's the loss of the whole town. There's a loss of a school and many schools and churches. And it's an enormous loss. Those folks don't even have a home to go to grieve their losses. And many of them are still living homeless. So yes, the loss of a home is huge. Another one right there in the back. Thank you for raising your hand.
Hi, thank you for being here. I was thinking of kind of in an unusual way. My daughter's a very feeling person. She feels what other people feels. I mean, we all have a sense of that in some way if we care. But she can feel things that are very relative to what the person is going through. And I was thinking about that in relationship to your question, because the impact sometimes of what people go through, no matter how positive and how strong and how independent we might be or how optimistic we might be, is so impacted by what we see in those we love, no matter how strong we are.
Beautiful.
And that feeling, that blow, that devastation that other people are going through in their experience, and because we love them, has such an impact on us and the world around us that, we really need to know how to deal with that.
Thank you so much for saying that. And in fact, we're going to talk a little bit further on in this session today about the individualness of our grief and why we need to know just what you've said, because it affects us all. Very well stated. I can take one more. Yes, let's add one more underneath that umbrella.
Well, my name's Kathy Young, and my story is a little bit different because I'll make it as quick as I can, but we had neighbors and friends that were family friends, and both of our daddies died from Roundup. Roundup.
Oh,
Roundup. Yes. My daddy died first, and then our friend's daddy died just about 6 months later. So, and I still mourn my dad because he had made arrangements, financial arrangements. I grew up on a cattle ranch, and we also farmed, and we had quite a bit of money. And when a little girl loses her daddy, it's just horrible. Yeah. And so every time I see the commercials on TV about Monsanto, don't ever stay away from it. And I know they're taking it off the market now, but they'll mask it with something else possibly. But I had the funniest, best daddy in the world. And so he's gone.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. This loss and grief umbrella, we stop to ponder. How many of our losses are under there? Do you have more than one? 2, 3, 4, 5 of them? Think about every human being you meet. Do they walk under and live under a loss and grief umbrella also? And when you all walk into church on a Sabbath morning, how many are walking underneath their loss and grief umbrellas? We all are. Oh, that we would recognize this with sensitivity for each other and treat each other with kindness. But the sad part is that we don't know each other's story. You've just shared your story, and now we know. But how rarely do we share these loss and grief stories? So does your grief matter? Let me hear it. Does someone else's grief matter? Yes, it does. It does. Can this broken cookie be put back together? No, but our broken hearts can be. Your broken heart matters. It matters because, let's see if we're going to get the only cure for grief is to grieve it. And we're going to say this frequently as this week goes by. The cure for grief is not to disown it, to abandon it, to pretend it didn't happen, to sweep it under the rug, to put it in a back closet someplace. The only cure for grief is to actually grieve it. Wow. Your grief matters. Your broken heart is known by God, and it is healable by God. We might be able to slab a big bunch of icing over this broken cookie and kind of put it on the platter and hope it stays together. But God can heal the broken heart. It matters to him. He heals the brokenhearted. And as I was going through my dark valley after Dawson's death, this was my flag planted. Either God means what he says in Psalms 147:3, I heal the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds, or it's just a meme. It's just a sweet saying. I chose to believe that he meant what he said. And healing began to take place in my life. So very glad. So let's take a look now. What do we bring with our grief? You know, I would love to just know that at the moment that the crisis takes place, the loss occurs, that our slates are wiped clean, and we just get to deal with that one pain. But is that what happens? No. What do we bring with our grief? We bring ourselves, dragging it along in this heavy suitcase. What are some of the things that are in this heavy suitcase? Yeah, unresolved conflict is there. Maybe right around the situation that has to do with the loss. Maybe unresolved conflicts that have nothing to do with the loss, but they're still dragging around with us. Prior losses that we never dealt with. Our guilt, regret, shame, and blame drags right into this grief with us. Any abuse or neglect that we've had in our past that creates triggers for us when we get into a painful and hurtful situation. Do we drag our distrust into our grief? Some of us create an addiction that comes from our grief because we don't know that there's a better way to deal with our pain, and we find that for just a little while, if I go shopping, I feel a little better. Or for just a little while, if I just take that sleeping pill a little earlier tonight, I don't have to think about my pain. Or for just a little while, if I get super involved with everything at the church, I'll distract myself and I don't have to do that. Now, those are kind of culturally acceptable ways of distracting our grief. What happens when we go to just over the edge and use a substance or a behavior that distracts our pain? And that then becomes an addiction. We bring our faith, either be it strong and well and healthy and robust, or if it's already been a little weak. We might bring character strengths and character weaknesses. People often say, you know, with the death of a child, that is a high risk for the death of that marriage, the end of that marriage. And there's something really to be said for that, and it's usually because before the death of the child occurred, that marriage was already at risk. So that death of a child is not going to bring that marriage closer together. So these are some of the things we drag along with us into our grief and into our loss. And that makes that every grief is completely and totally unique. Take a look at your thumbprint. You're the only one on planet Earth with that configuration. Your grief will be the only grief like it. Now stop and pause for just a moment. If my grief is completely unique, and I'll use my husband and our relationship, my husband's grief is completely unique, isn't it? Yeah. So is that going to be an easy or a hard thing in our grief together? It can make it hard. I think of a family that has 11 children, 10 of them living at home, and one of them took his life. And now they're all under this roof, filled with pain over the 19-year-old who took his life. How does that much pain coexist under one roof? That family really needs some support going through that kind of loss. So let's take a look a little closer. Gender is a factor in our grieving. Male and females will relate differently with their losses. Now, these are typical ways, so you can be atypical, and that's perfectly fine. But typically, a man wants to fix it, repair it, put it back together. And when that can't happen, what happens in the male mind? It can generate frustration, which then feeds and fuels anger. And people can move into that angry place without even realizing that it's attached to the brokenness of the pain and their gender response to that. Let's take another look. Our birth order plays a factor in how we grieve individually. I happen to have been a firstborn in my family. So anybody else out here firstborns? Okay, tell me what being a firstborn is like. What do you do? Just shout it out real loud. Yeah, you both said it. You take responsibility. You're responsible, right? So if there's like a need, you jump in and do that. Exactly. So then we're going to grieve in that way, aren't we? We're going to be the doers when we're needing to prepare for the memorial or the funeral or helping somebody. I live with my mom. My stepfather died about a year ago, and I'm the firstborn, and I'm the doer, there to do for her what she needs. So our birth order will change that. My husband was thirdborn, middle child, and doing wasn't nearly as important to him. And because of the position in his family, he was the most tender and gentle of all the children, most sensitive of all the children. And so his grief took on that birth order expression of being more sensitive. And it looked like I wasn't hurting and feeling at all because I didn't have that same sensitivity that he had. Our temperaments and our personalities also play a factor, so that when we grieve these losses, we're going to do that in the way that we are created and designed. My temperament is, following my birth order, is that strong, take charge, choleric. I've got this kind of temperament. I'm kind of a type A personality. My husband's a type B personality. He's a phlegmatic, which means that, he'll just go with the flow with whatever happens. So he's going to grieve in that way while I grieve in my way. Could that cause conflict and misunderstanding? It can, can't it? There's a couple more. My relationship to our son was a mother relationship. His relationship to our son was a father relationship. Are those unique relationships? Absolutely. I'm thinking of some of you whose parents have died, and you have siblings, and each of you were a son or a daughter of that parent with your own temperaments, your own gender, your own birth order. So is your relationship with that parent going to be unique? One of a kind. It won't be like your siblings. And sometimes those differences really come up to a head, and siblings find it difficult to work well together after the death of one of their parents. Another factor is the type of the death or the type of the loss. When there is a severe crisis, extreme, painful, I'm hunting for the word, a violent death, that kind of grief to that is going to be way different than the death that was described to me not too long ago of somebody's mother. They anticipated her death. The family all arrived there just in time. They sat around her bed, playing the guitar and singing songs and sharing precious memories as their mother breathed her last sacred breath. What a very different type of death than someone like Daryl Bigger, whose daughter was murdered in the Washington, D.C. area in her own apartment. Do you see the difference of grief there? Depending upon the type of loss and death. And then last of all, what influences our, let's see if I can get that, is the relationship with. I had a stepfather that died a year ago, and about 9 months later, I had a birth father that passed away. Both died within 12 months of one another. And I had people that were so gracious and kind to come to console me and say, oh, Karen, this is so hard to have the death of your parent. And many of them didn't really realize that my stepfather was a stepfather because I had called him Dad all my life since my mom married him. And some of them had no idea I had a birth father. And the relationship with both of these earthly fathers was not endearing or treasured or special. I had an awkward relationship. I had an unfulfilled relationship. So the relationship with will change the kind of grief we have. So these all play factors that create our own unique grief. On the other hand, I had a childhood girlfriend whose father died just a year before mine did, and she grieved deeply his death. She had such a close and tender relationship, and she told me of how his death had left an enormous hole in her life, maybe similar to yours. And so her grief and my grief were very different from one another. So these give us some ideas about how and why we grieve differently. But what we really want to find out are, what do others have to say about grief? Now, I've got a handout that's just going to be handed out to you here right now, and I'd like for you to move again, get in some kind of circles of 7 or 8, turn around. We're going to read through this handout here. It's called The Words of Wisdom from Other Grievers. So I need handouts handed out very quickly because we have just a few minutes before as our time is finishing. Could anybody assist the handouts to get them handed out? And while you're waiting for them to be handed out, start moving and getting a group of 10 or 8 and put yourself in a place where you can connect together. Okay, good. We've got lots more handouts coming out. Good job. I hear chairs moving. We want to kind of just get in a circle. Oh, it feels good to stand and stretch, doesn't it? You bet. So, your grief matters. Words of wisdom from fellow grievers. Okay, and once again, there we go. Looks like everybody's settled. There's another hand up that needs a handout. Right there. You guys are an amazing group. You've done this fantastic. I am so blessed. So now that you're all settled, let me explain what you're going to do. For those that would like to read out loud, you're going to take one of these quotes and read it to the group, and then then the next person next to you is going to read the next quote, and you're going to read through all the quotes. When you're done with the quotes, you're going to spend just a couple of minutes sharing which quote spoke to you and why. Now, let me tell you, we could sit in these circles for 30 minutes easily, but we won't have time to do that. So I'm going to have to cut it off in about 6 minutes. So read quickly all of them and then share really briefly which quote mattered, While you're doing that, I'm going to go to this other camera and talk to those that are watching us on screen. And when I'm done there, I'll bring us all back together, and we're going to finish up with just a few more slides. Go ahead and begin. Well, I'm so happy to be able to read to you these words of wisdom from other grievers. And as you listen, think about one that says, oh, wow, that one speaks to me. The first one is written by Harold Kushner, who is a Jewish rabbi, and his son died. And this is what he says: "We can endure much more than we think we can. All human experience testifies to that. All we need to do is to learn not to be afraid of the pain. Grit your teeth and let it hurt. Don't deny it. Don't be overwhelmed by it. It will not last forever. One day the pain will be gone and you will still be there." Wow. Who's ever told you that pain is okay? We're going to talk about that in a little bit. The next one is by Earl Grolman, and he says, "Grief is not a disorder or a disease or a sign of weakness. Instead, it's an emotional and physical and spiritual necessity. It's the price we pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve." Bernie Siegel says, "One cannot get through life without pain. What we do is how we choose how that pain will present itself in our life." So let me read that again. What we can do is choose how to use the pain that comes to our lives. The next one is, there are 3 needs of a griever. 1 is to find the words for our loss. 2 is to say those words. And last of all is to know that those words have been heard. Victoria Alexander. There's no grief like the grief that does not speak, Henry Wadsworth once wrote. A different Henry Maudsley, wrote, "The sorrow which has no vent in tears may make other organs weep. He that conceals his grief finds no remedy for it." That's a Turkish proverb. "The risk of love is loss, and the price of loss is grief. But the pain of grief is only a shadow when compared with the pain of never risking love." Henry Zunan. "You cannot prevent the birds of sorrow from flying over your head, but you can prevent them from building a nest in your hair." That's an old Chinese proverb. And Jesus once said, as recorded in Matthew, "Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Do not protect your grief by offense, but rather by your friends. That's a Czech proverb. There's a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief and unspeakable love. Washington Irving. Our last quote right now is, "Mourning is one of the most profound human experiences that is possible to have. The deep capacity to weep for the loss of a loved one and to continue to treasure the memory of that loss is one of our noblest traits." What do you think? Do you think grief matters? That each loss is unique? Each grieving person is unique? And that when we grieve, giving ourselves permission to speak the words, to weep the tears, that we're doing something really healthy and important. I know our culture hasn't taught us how to do that. So you're here with us, and hopefully you'll be able to tune in every day for the next 5 days so that you'll be able to learn how to grieve in a healthy way. This is just a start. Okay, I'm going to ask about 12 seconds to wrap up your conversations. And we'll start at 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. You're welcome to stay seated right where you're at. You don't need to move. Just as long as you can see the screen, we've got a couple more slides to go through. Was this conversation beneficial for anybody? Yes. Do you see, it's like no one's given us permission to talk about this. And here today, every day from 4 to 5, you will have that permission to do so. And as we learn from each other, we will learn and grow in our strength and our awareness of how to grieve in a healthy way. So let's take a look at 2 really important pieces just before we finish up. Grief has a purpose. Now, if something has a purpose, then it matters, doesn't it? So what are some of the purposes of grief? This little list is not all-inclusive or exhaustive. So give it some thought and have some discussion about it further as you go through your day and evening tonight. One of the purposes of grief is that it is the process that allows us to adjust to the loss. So if we're intentional about this process, do you think our grief will be healthier? Absolutely, it will be. The next one is that grief, a healthy grief, part of that intentional process is to interact with forgiveness. The forgiveness sets us free in our grief. It takes care of all those regrets, blame, shame, woulda, coulda, shouldas. And we're going to spend all day on Wednesday talking about the forgiveness piece. It also has the purpose of keeping us aware that God is the one who goes with us through this valley. We don't go through this space alone. He is with us. And with Him with us, the purpose of our grief is then to bring healing for us, which then enlarges our capacity to have compassion to other people, doesn't it? Now, I don't know if you noticed that the first quote in this list that we read had to do with pain. And Harold Kushner talked about pain, and that we would get through the pain, that one day we would wake up and the pain would be gone and we would still be here. So pain also has a purpose, and these are a few of the things that its purpose is. It has an alarm factor, bong, getting us our attention going, do something. This is an acute pain. It sharpens our focus and our reflection on what's happening around us so that we might be able to respond to that pain in the best way possible. It motivates us to action, doesn't it? And it acts as our guide. I walked up, what's the mountain? Thumbprint Mountain? Thumb Butte. I found my way up to the top of that space this morning early, just right after sunrise. And the hike up was exhilarating for sure, but the hike down was a little more frightening. Why? Because it's steep and there's rocks, and that's an easier direction when gravity is pulling you downhill for the option of falling. But let's just pretend that I fell this morning and I broke my leg. And I didn't go attend to it. Instead, I came here to do this talk with us today, and there was still blood down my leg, and the bone was sticking out because it was a compound fat fracture, and I was limping on crutches. Thank you. And what would you think of me? I was a crazy person. Why didn't I go get that attended to, right? Obvious. This hurts. Yes, it hurt. But if I did what most of us do with grief, I wouldn't pay attention to the pain. I wouldn't let it act as an alarm. I wouldn't let it motivate me to take action. But because the broken heart is inside and no one sees that, and we're really good in our culture of putting up a facade and a fake and a pretend, I keep going in my life with this broken heart. That's ridiculous. It's just as ridiculous as if I'd shown up on this stage with a broken leg. And so the pain is there for a purpose. It's a really important purpose. Let's pay attention to it and not fear it. So to finish off our time together, our grief matters to God because we matter to God. Jesus came into this planet, landed in the middle of our pain, took on our grief and our sorrow, acquainted with it intimately, and it matters to our God. Let's see. Psalms 56:8 says, "You kept track of my every loss, of my every toss and turn through the sleepless nights. Each tear entered in your ledger, each ache written in your book." Does he know? He knows. Does he care? He cares. Jesus' mission as he proclaimed it to the synagogue in Nazareth included this: "He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to comfort all who mourn, and to provide for those who grieve in Zion." I have told you these things that Jesus has just told his disciples just maybe hours before his arrest. I've told you these things. You would find them in John 13, 14, 15, and 16. At the very end of 16, and he's getting ready to leave. "I've told you these things so that in me you may have," what did it say? Peace. He says, because where do you live? You live on planet Earth. What happens on this planet is, in this world, you will have trouble. Does he know that? Yes. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Thank you, God. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you that we can have peace in this troubled world. Thank you. We do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like those who grieve with no hope. It doesn't say we don't want you to grieve. We just don't want you to grieve like those with no hope. So this week, we're going to be looking at what is the hope of healthy grief. These conversations have not started among our people. They've not started in our culture. But you are going to get to go away from Arizona camp meeting knowing how to grieve with hope, how to grieve a healthy way. Isn't that worth being here? You bet. So I can't wait to be with you tomorrow at 4 o'clock as we continue taking a look at our grief and what healthy grief looks like. And on Wednesday, we're going to talk about forgiveness and grief. Thursday and Friday, we're going to talk about how do we help others who are grieving? How do we come into their space of pain and know that we can bring them comfort and support through their loss? It's been a delight being with you this afternoon. Say that again, Steve. It's okay. Just a last reminder that you might want to pick up. I would totally encourage you to get this so you're ready for tomorrow, because we're going to take a look at our physical, emotional, and spiritual grief, and all of that is found in our book, Comfort for the Day, Living Through the Seasons of Grief. So our ABC, Sandy is right there ready to help assist you be able to pick up a book, so you can come with this in hand tomorrow. And are you wanting to close us off with prayer? Would you? Oh, okay. Why don't we pray? Dear Lord, thank you so much that our grief matters to you. Thank you that you know how to bring it healing and restoration. Thank you that you've brought us to this place to learn this together. You are a good God all the time. In Jesus' name, amen.